My watch needs a new battery. You can tell that right away. Okay, welcome to How to Make a Better Villain. I'm probably going to talk loud, and they're probably going to adjust my sound volume, so bear with our sound guys while I do that. We have 45 minutes to get through this talk, which really means I only have a half an hour because I would love to give you guys a question and answer session. So it might run a little quick on some of these as I try and blitz through the material, and you've probably heard that before from some of the other speakers as well. If you'll notice up here, I've got 3 different villains. Now, horror villains tend to make bad villains in the parlance of what I'm going to speak about. But as I talk, I want you to consider Jason and Freddy and Carrie. One of them I consider to be a great villain, and the other 2 I do not. And then we'll do a little quiz towards the end. But before we get too much further, let me introduce myself. My name is Bruce Nesmith. My credentials are a little unusual for 20Books. I worked at TSR making Dungeons & Dragons products for many years. Most notably, the Ravenloft box set for 2nd edition AD&D. And then I transferred into the video game industry, where I worked for Bethesda Softworks, making games that most of you probably have not heard of, like Skyrim and Fallout. And I'm only a budding novelist. I have 2 books out right now, Mischief Maker and Odin's Return in the urban fantasy genre. So I do not have the same novelist background as people who've written 147 books. But I do think I bring a certain knowledge base to what it makes a good villain based on my other experiences. Caveat to that, I am not know-all. I am not be-all. I do not have the absolute perfect definition of a villain. These are my experiences. These are my opinions. And you all will have an opportunity to help me refine those by either offering your own or asking questions at the end of the presentation. But villains are primary in video games, and they're primary in Dungeons & Dragons products, and they're something that you see all the time in novels as well. So, first, not every novel has a villain. A novel is not a requirement. A villain, excuse me, is not a requirement. A villain is not the same as the antagonist. Those are 2 very different things, and it's important to understand that. And here are some sample books that are fantastic books, bestsellers, that do not have villains, although they may have antagonists. So when you're looking at your book, and you're looking at your writing, or whatever entertainment product you're creating, don't assume you need to have a villain. If you have a villain, then you're going to be able to get something out of this talk in terms of what it means to be a good villain and how to make it. But don't make the assumption that you've got to have one. My favorite entry up there, by the way, is the last one, The Slow Regard of Silent Things by Patrick Rothfuss. It's an amazing, amazing, amazing book. If you haven't read it, I urge you to do so. So, what defines a villain? And I'm finding the same thing everybody else did. I can't read my computer, but I can lean my head over and read the actual screen. Okay? So, this is what literaryterms.net defines as a villain. It's the bad guy who comes up with a diabolical plot to cause harm or ruin. And this is why not every antagonist is a villain. They're not all trying to cause harm. They're not all trying to cause ruin. So, the antagonist is frequently a villain, but not always. Everybody here seen Enola Holmes? Yeah, not as many as I thought. Okay. It's very popular on Netflix right now. But in the first movie, Mycroft arguably could be considered to be the antagonist. But he's not really a villain. He has Enola's best interests at heart. He just doesn't agree with her on what those best interests are. He's trying to push her into being a typical Victorian woman, compliant, subservient to her husband, so that she can be safe and have a place where she can raise children and bear them, and in his mind, be happy. And she rejects all of that utterly. But that doesn't make him a villain, because he's not trying to bring ruin to her. So, villains do bad or evil things. Their motivations is what distinguish them. That's what distinguishes an antagonist from a villain, is the motivation. Do they want to do that bad or evil thing, or are they doing what they think is right and not harming people in the process? So let's look at the attributes of a villain. I've got 5 of them up here. And the first one is immorality. So, a villain is immoral. And they're not necessarily seeing themselves as immoral, but they're committing acts that go against the society they're in, go against the thinking of the times, and go against what most people consider to be good or right or proper behavior. Power. Your villain needs to have power. That doesn't mean they need to be ultimately powerful, but they need to have power. They need to be able to have power over your hero in some way, shape, or form. And we will look at each one of these in more depth. Proactive. This is not a requirement to be a villain. This is a requirement to be a good villain. The first 2 were requirements to be a villain at all. This is the first one that actually distinguishes good from just run-of-the-mill garden variety villain. So they are proactive. In your stories, they are not just sitting back waiting for the hero to approach them. They are not just sitting back waiting for events to carry them along. They are pushing events forward. They are creating conflict that your hero, or heroes, or whatever group you've got there, are actively going to have to resist, deal with, subvert, or otherwise handle. Motivation. This one came up a minute ago. Motivation also distinguishes a good hero from a bad hero. They need to have something that the reader understands as the why they are doing it. So they don't just be evil because being evil is cool. It's not evil of the month club up here, okay? They have to have a reason, and a reason that your reader can actually understand and have some sympathy for. And the final one is one that doesn't always strike people. Tragedy. A great hero, as opposed to a good hero, is a tragic figure. It feeds into their motivation. It feeds into why they are doing things. It feeds into your reader's ability to sympathize with them, makes them more human, because we want our villains to be human. We want our villains to be these sad, tragic characters, and it feeds into everything else that is going to make a good villain for you. Oh, I had 6. See, this is what happens when you don't review your slide presentation beforehand. So lesson to everybody, please write this down. I want to see pens moving. Review your slide deck before you give your presentation. Personality. If your villain is this stoic block, they have no personality. There's nothing for the reader to hang their hat on. There's no sympathy. There's no engagement. And you want engagement with a great villain. So they need to have a personality, and it's up to you as an author to bring that personality forward. So let's look at some of these in more detail. Immorality. So this is one of the big things that distinguishes a villain from an antagonist. Mycroft Holmes in the Enola films is an antagonist because he is not acting immorally. Now, arguably, he's not acting immorally due to the standards of the time or the views of the people in the society in which the film is made. By today's standards, he might be considered immoral. So that becomes a little bit of a gray zone, and none of these things are going to be completely black or white where there's a strict line that says above this you are and below this you are not. Dolores Umbridge, on the other hand, yeah, now that's one immoral little bitch. So, yeah. So immorality, this is very important. It's one of the distinguishing features between antagonist and villain. Death, destruction, psychological harm, these are the things that they are trying to cause. These are definitions of their immorality. These are the activities that they are performing that will define them as immoral. And once again, it's judged in the terms of the society they are in, if it's more psychological or societal. Obviously, physical harm, you want to blow up the Eiffel Tower, yeah, that's kind of generic. Everybody's going to think that's a bad thing to do. And I keep talking about the societal definition. Morality is in the eye of the beholder. Something that I might consider immoral, you might not consider immoral. You are going to have to define that for your readers, and you're going to have to spend some time and attention on it. You're going to have to make sure that they understand this is immoral. You may be able to get away with it with a simple sentence, because the immorality is something that's clear to everybody. You know, I want to kill 50% of all sentient beings in the universe. Okay, I only need to say that sentence, that's it. I don't need to go any further. You are clearly immoral. But you may need to spend more time defining it if your immorality has a more contextual feel to it or is more subtle. And the villain, a great villain, needs to see their actions as not being immoral. They're not sitting in the corner cackling to themselves, I'm doing this great evil thing. Even Dolores Umbridge sees her actions as moral. She is trying to get Hogwarts University to comply and produce what she considers to be the appropriate types of wizards. Yes, it's immoral. It's immoral by just about every standard you can imagine, but she, in her twisted little mind, isn't thinking that way. If your villain believes they are doing something immoral, they're still a villain. I would argue they're not a great villain. A touch of crazy is okay. If your villain is a villain because they're insane, that's weak, in my opinion. That's weak sauce. A little bit of crazy, I'm going to argue Dolores has a little bit of crazy, is fine. Being a little bit insane is character building in the sense that only those of us who are writers are going to agree is character building. But you don't want to go full-fledged insane. By the way, you can write a fabulous story with an antagonist who is full-fledged insane. This doesn't mean you can't make great stories about people who are totally around the bend. Most horror stories feature that. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about villains. And there is a difference there. And that's what I wanted to draw attention to here. So, Dolores Umbridge is trying to harm the students, but in her mind, she is also trying to keep them safe. If they comply, they will get to live. Lord Voldemort will not do bad things to them, and they'll grow up to be good little Slytherin children. That's her opinion. Power. So let's talk about power for a moment. So, power can come in a lot of forms. Physical, intellectual, political, magical, social, financial, probably a few others that I didn't even bother to put on here. But don't always assume power is physical, or that they have the ability to cause physical harm or distress as their primary goal. If you, and now I'm drawing a blank on the name of the movie, one of the Wall Street movies, Greed is Good, that villain had financial power. That was his hold over everybody else. That's the thing that made him a villain on the power index. So, they have to have or quickly acquire power over the hero. Excuse me, more power than the hero, not necessarily over immediately. So they don't have to start off this way, because villain origin stories are wonderful and amazing things. Everybody loves a good villain origin story. You know, just look at every Marvel movie ever made, right? But very quickly on, we have to see their transition. And that transition can be a powerful storytelling moment because you can feed into all of the motivations and tragedies and all the other things that I've listed here before. But they pretty quickly have to get to the point where they have more power than the hero. The hero can't just walk in and slap them around, lock them up, get them voted out of office. It has to feel like the villain is in charge. The villain holds all the cards, and the hero does not have enough. So the hero needs to seem to be outmatched. But he or she only needs to be, he, she, or they, only needs to be outmatched on the index of power. So if the villain is the President of the United States, and we've seen a few movies lately where we have evil presidents of the United States, that's political power. But our sniper, Green Beret, warrior soldier has physical power that obviously the president doesn't match. So the power indexes don't have to be overwhelming on all scales, but there has to be a lane in which the villain outmatches the hero and can cause conflict and can cause problems for the hero, which are going to be the grist of your story in how the hero overcomes that using whatever his powers and abilities are to overmatch someone who clearly dominates him in this other lane. And extra points if the villain's power grows or changes. Growth is something that we always want to see in our characters. All too often we forget about it with the villain. This is why it's also cool to have the villain not start out with the powers and get to see the origin story. Doesn't always work for everyone's story though, so don't force that in. But let's go back to our president analogy. You have someone who is the vice president or is running for president, and then they get to be president. Their power grows during the course of the story. That's bonus points. Thanos' power grows as he gets the gems for the Infinity Gauntlet. So, Thanos' power is on a physical level, the simplest and easiest of the different types of power levels. And he grows more powerful as he gains Infinity Stones. So, pretty simple dynamic there. Let's look at proactive. So, the villain is driving the plot. Now, the villain doesn't have to drive the plot throughout the entire story. In fact, that's probably a bad idea. But initially, if the villain has power and the villain is being proactive, then the villain's the guy who's doing stuff and the hero's reactive initially. And then there's a cutover. There's a changeover where the hero suddenly becomes the one who can be proactive and the villain is on their back feet. Sometimes that happens in the last chapter. Sometimes that happens halfway through the book. That's a decision you as authors get to make. But you do need to see that they're driving the plot. And that's the fun stuff, because you get to do things a hero doesn't get to do when you're playing with the villain. So early on, the hero's reactive. I got ahead of my slide. In reacting to the villain's actions, and then that flips. So ideally, they are proactive directly against the hero. It's not a requirement, but it makes it a more personal story. It motivates and gives motivation to the hero when the villain is actively against them and not just like against the world at large. So Sauron sends out the ring wraiths in search for the One Ring. He is proactive. So this causes problems for Frodo and the companions because they have to deal with these ring wraiths before they can even get to dealing with Sauron. So Sauron's driving the plot at that moment. And then later it flip-flops when Frodo gets into Mordor. So, Michael Myers, he hunts Jamie in the Halloween movies. Now, I said earlier that horror villains tend to make poor villains, in my personal opinion, but this is still a good way to look at things. He's driving the plot, and then she has to flip the script and start hunting him later on. Let's look at motivation. So, your reader needs to know why the villain does what they do. Not necessarily from the get-go. It doesn't have to be page 1, line 1, word 1. But at some point, that motivation needs to become clear. Because I keep wanting to say player. See, this is what happens when you make games for a living. Your hero and your reader, most importantly your reader, need to understand why this is going on. It can be a fascinating question for the first part of your book, maybe even the first 3/4 of your book. But at some point, your reader's got to know, why is this happening? Why does this guy want to blow up the Empire State Building? Why do they want to turn the sun off? Why do they want to get elected president? Actually, that one answers itself. I want to be elected president. Everybody can understand that. At some point, we need to learn why. And ideally, once again, we're defining great villains versus just villains. It should be based on events in their own past. The why they want to do this should be something that suddenly makes sense. It should be related to their motivation. It should be related to their background, to their tragedy. And then they become a complete character. And characters are what readers always want to see. And extra points if that motivation is tied directly to the hero. Spider-Man villains are probably a good example of that. They all hate Spider-Man because he did something to them. So now it becomes extremely personal. Now it's something that is one-on-one right at your protagonist. Wicked Witch of the West, she's after Dorothy because Dorothy dropped a house on her sister. That's pretty personal. Someone drops a house on my sister, well, I might say thank you. No, I wouldn't say thank you. I love my sisters. But it becomes something very personal, and it becomes something that you can work with as an author to tie those two in knots together that have to be untangled as a part of your plot. Coming back to insane. Insane is weak motivation. My personal opinion, you could maybe pull up a professor of literature up here and they might contradict me on that, and I would probably have to bow to their superior knowledge. But in my opinion, they're insane. Is just, don't go there. Touch of crazy, great stuff. Insane, not great stuff. So, the Wicked Witch of the West wants revenge for the death of her sister, and she's got dual motivation. She wants the power of the ruby slippers. So she's got two motivations, and notice both of them go directly to the heroine. Dorothy's got the ruby slippers. I want them. You got them. I have to kill you to get them. Sorry, I just got to do it. That's the morality part of the question. And I don't like you anyway because you dropped a house on my sister. Tragedy. Now we're delving much more into greatness as opposed to just villain. A villain that doesn't have anything that can be sympathetic to them is not going to resonate as much with your readers. And your readers want to resonate with your villain. They want to feel like they understand this villain, like this villain is cool because look at all the things that happen. They may say out loud, look at the things they can do, but the tragedy involved in that villain, that's actually something that really draws them in. Phantom of the Opera. Great, great tragic villain. His tragedy is clear and obvious, and it comes out in every scene he is in, and is something that every one of us can understand, particularly as authors. His work was stolen. Think about that for a moment. Somebody stole your book and published it themselves and made it so you couldn't ever be an author again. Yeah, I might want to go kill everybody and burn down the house too. So, why did the villain become the way they are? This is a central question that you should write down before you start much of your novel, or short story, or novella, or play, or whatever it might happen to be. You need to understand it. If you don't understand it, how can you expect your reader to understand it? So you need to understand the why of that. And the tragedy can be used to drive the motivation. It isn't always exactly the motivation, but it can be used to drive it. So if the tragedy and the motivation are integrally linked, That's really powerful. I'm doing this because. And if you think about some of the great villains, Thanos is a great example of that. Why does he want to kill everybody, half the people in the universe? Wicked Witch of the West, the Phantom of the Opera, all of these villains, their tragedy is driving their motivation. I experienced this tragedy. It twisted who I am. I'm now willing to commit immoral acts in order to achieve my new goals. Extra points if it makes the villain sympathetic. If you say the Wicked Witch of the West's motivations, not particularly sympathetic for the ruby slipper part. It'd be better for the sister part if it felt like she actually liked her sister, the Wicked Witch of the East, but you kind of get the feeling she didn't. So if it makes the villain sympathetic, Phantom of the Opera is definitely a sympathetic villain. Now your reader is almost like they have to choose between the hero or the villain. Whose side do I want to be on here? And that tension within the reader becomes tension on the page and makes for great storytelling. So, Phantom of the Opera is horribly disfigured and longs for a woman he cannot have. They stole his great work. I mean, what didn't happen to this poor schlub? He's had the worst life imaginable. And so he wants to seek revenge, and he wants to tear down the whole house with it. Personality. Okay. So this makes the villain recognizable. And I will reinforce once again, it is not a requirement. It is something that can distinguish great from good villains. You don't have to have a great villain. A good villain is frequently more than enough. But a personality is something that as a writer, you can hang your hat on when dealing with your villain so that your reader has a way to say, this is special. It works a little bit better in movies than it does in books, but boy, something particular to the villain is always wonderful. So you give them a physical, verbal, mental, social quirk or habit, something so that they're not just Joe on the street. What makes them cool? And particularly, a lot of people here, I imagine, are writing some sort of speculative fiction, although I might get a lot of mystery and thriller people in this audience for the villain of it. But in particular, those characters tend to have some of these quirks. So you look at Voldemort, he's got that physical thing. I know he's a villain. Why is he a villain? He doesn't have a nose. You don't have a nose, you've got to be a villain. Well, and Ralph Fiennes' masterful performance with all that theatrical moving and hands and everything, he just feels like a villain. He exudes villainous. You got to write that. You got to make your reader feel that villainous. Villainous? Villainous is a female villain, I guess. Villainy is probably what I should be saying. And your villain is going to need screen time for you to show it. If your villain is always in the background, you can still write a great story, reiterating that point, but the personality can't come through unless they get screen time. So if you're doing a multiple POV, it's easy to give them screen time. Doing a single POV, you may need to have some interactions between your hero and villain in order to be able to bring that out. For written material, you don't have the lack of nose to reinforce easily. So speech patterns and physical tics become a really easy way to do this. Because you don't want to keep writing, oh, and he doesn't have a nose. 2 paragraphs later, and he doesn't have a nose. That's not going to fly. Your readers aren't going to like that. So having some speech patterns, they begin a lot of sentences with or they cackle a lot. Don't do that one. That's a bad one, but I'm thinking of the Wicked Witch of the West there. But something that you can use to help distinguish them voice-wise, and I'm talking writer voice here, not literal voice, although it can be literal voice, is going to really elevate your villain. Voldemort has a whispery voice and no nose. So he's got both of these things going for him. One, I could put in a book. The other would be a little challenging. You could put it in, but you wouldn't be able to reinforce it without it feeling very repetitive and awkward. Okay, an interesting hero grows and changes. I'm going to have to accelerate. I've only got a little bit of time, and I want to make sure that I get to questions and answers. So, they can grow in many ways. Growing in power is the least interesting. Changing motivations is great. Fresh tragedies is great. Changing their power is also okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not as strong as changing some of the other things. Morality can shift. They start to question whether or not what they're doing really is the right thing to do. Or maybe they double down. They can experience fresh tragedies. Darth Vader renounced his allegiance to the Emperor. That's a big deal for Darth Vader. Yeah, it's almost like switching sides. So, now, I'm going to try and blitz through this. We're going to play a little game of good villain or great villain. So as I run through these, just raise your hand if you think this villain has this. So we're looking at Magneto here, right? Oh, that didn't work. Dang it, why didn't that work? Oh, okay. This obviously is an older presentation because I had separated out the words from my feelings on it. So that's bad on me. I brought down the wrong one. So these are my feelings on Magneto. And you may have different ones, and that's okay. I'm certainly not going to be the world's expert on villainy up here. But this is how I feel I would rate them. So, Magneto gets a check on the first 5 of these very easily. I'm not going to run through them because we don't have time. Personality-wise, in the comics, he does not have the tragedy element, or the personality element down, as well as Ian McKellen gave him in the movies. Ian McKellen, I mean, he's freaking Ian McKellen, I mean, come on. Gave him tremendous personality. He's a little flat and stereotypical in the comics. Interesting villains. Oh, I went the wrong way, you're right. I had my fingers on the wrong one, there we go. So, Dolores Umbridge. Who thinks she's a great villain? Who thinks she's only a good villain? Who thinks she's a crappy villain? There not better be any hands up for that one. She's a pretty darn good villain. So, oh, I see I did this one right. I just did the first one wrong. So, that's how I rate her. She has a great personality, by the way. Oh, I'd love to write that character. But she doesn't have any background tragedy. We don't understand how she became who she is. So I'm going to rate her as a good villain. Because a great villain's got to check all these boxes. Thanos. Great villain? Good villain. Crappy villain. Yeah, once again, we got a couple crappy villains back there. Okay. That's how I rate Thanos. It's not that he doesn't have tragedy. It's just not as strong as I think they could have done. They didn't really bring it forward in the writing. It's sort of like, oh yeah, he had this. Personality, he feels kind of monolithic to me. And if you read the comics, it's even worse on those. The comics, frequently their heroes are very stereotypical. They're not as interesting. They're very flat. So I would call him a good villain. Sauron. Great villain? Good villain. Crappy villain. Okay. See, I'm not going to argue the crappy villains on Sauron. Sauron's an extremely remote figure. That's how I rate Sauron. So he's got the immorality thing and the power and the proactive. His motivation's a little bit weak. I'm never really sure why Sauron's doing what he's doing. I kind of have to do a deep delve into the Silmarillion, waste a good week of my life. It's there if you read. I mean, he's got some tragedy. He has zero personality in the movies and in the Lord of the Rings books. Although the new series about the Ring of Power, he could be really cool there. So I'm going to say he's an okay villain. He's far too remote for me. He just doesn't get the screen time that he really needs. Wicked Witch of the West. Great villain? Good villain. Crappy villain. Oh, we got a couple crappy villains back there. Okay. Those fighting words. I think she's pretty good except on the tragedy. I think if there had been more attention paid to her relationship to the Wicked Witch of the East, she could have elevated to a great villain. But in my opinion, she's got all the rest of it. So I rate her a good villain. It's interesting, we haven't had any great villains yet. Oh, I did rate him great, didn't I? Yep. So, let's look at Voldemort. Great villain? Good villain? Crappy villain? Ah, we got a crappy villain over there for him. Yeah, but if it was your high school. Okay. I consider him to be a pretty good villain, but there's caveats here. I think his motivation is weak. You know, he just wants power because he wants to rule the world, and that's certainly motivation, but it's kind of boring. You know, we've seen that, done that. He's got some tragedy, but only after his first defeat, when he then has to come back, you know, behind the head of that other professor. And the personality comes out in the movies. If you read the books, his personality is a little flatter there. And that, once again, is a tribute to the great Ralph Fiennes, who did a masterful job with him. So I call him a good villain. Darth Vader. Great villain? Good villain? Crappy villain? I got one crappy villain back there. Why do you hate Star Wars? Why do you hate freedom? Okay. I actually consider Darth Vader, and I was surprised at these results, by the way. I didn't know how I was going to rate them. Did I do something wrong up here? Did it not come up? Oh. I think he ticks all the boxes. You know, particularly the important boxes of tragedy and personality. I mean, I can describe Darth Vader without saying a word. I don't know that I want to have to write that. That might get a little rough, but boy, you don't even have to say a word. It's like, that's Darth Vader, and you start shaking in your boots, right? So I consider him to be a great villain. So now we're down to questions. So, really quick question from me to you. If I go back to that first slide, and I had those 3 horror villains. Jason, who thinks Jason is a great villain? All right, you've learned something here. How about Freddy? Freddy's better than Jason. How about Carrie? Carrie's got tragedy, motivation, personality. Mousy and afraid and hiding is personality. It is something as a writer I can write on and I can make highly sympathetic. Personality does not have to be out there. It just has to be distinguishing. Okay, so we have 7 minutes for questions. There's a microphone over here. Please use the microphone because otherwise nobody who listens to the stream can hear the question. Yes, sir, and I will try to keep these quick and moving on. Yes?
Thanks a lot. I'm really interested in villains in cinema, but I'm thinking of the villain in Robinson Crusoe, who utterly lacks tragedy, but is one of the most memorable villains on the big screen.
Memorable frequently in movies comes down to performance. I kept calling Ralph Fiennes great, but I didn't call the villain great. The villain was good. I would argue that the sheriff was a good villain, but not a great villain. But boy, that performance, that was knocked down fantastic. I agree with that. Yes?
So for like dark romance writers, like enemies to lovers, and that kind of arc, a lot of times the villain, like what makes us love the villain, makes the heroine fall in love with the villain. How, plot-wise, does the villain always need to be like defeated in the end? Like, do you feel like that needs to happen for a strong villain?
A villain does not need to be defeated permanently. A villain at least needs to have a serious setback. But in a dark romance, depending upon how you're building your story, you may not actually have a villain, you may have an antagonist. Because frequently, if you go to enemies to lovers, you don't want to have a great villain. They've got nothing for a lover to want over here. They need to actually be one step down so that they have some redeeming features, and then they can be converted over. That's my personal opinion, by the way. Yes, sir?
So I guess this is more for my own research. In my series of books, I have the villain change to a different villain over the course of the trilogy. Do you know any good examples off the top of your head where that happened in media? I'm thinking maybe like in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man where, Green Goblin was killed and James Franco took over, that kind of thing? Or good examples of it?
Are you talking about a completely different character becomes the villain, or the villain themselves changes to a completely different personality?
Character.
New character? Personally, I don't think that's a good idea. I bet I could pull up some more literary-minded people up here and they might disagree with me. A great writer could pull off anything. But I always see that as something that would be between books of a serial rather than within a single book. I think that's a dramatic enough shift in your plot that should become the next book rather than just a change in the middle. Because you're fracturing your reader. Your reader's saying, oh, look at this, and this is going to happen, and that's done. And who the hell is this guy? And they have to rebuild that relationship with a new villain all over again. But I'm betting a quality writer, your Stephen Kings and what that could probably pull it off with panache and writers would eat it up. I'm not that good a writer for that. Yes, sir.
How do you deal with the hidden puppet master in the background to make them the great villain, but you don't want to actually reveal them to the end and say, oh, surprise, this is the twist, without ruining the twist well in advance?
Once again, you don't have to have a great villain. An antagonist does not have to be a villain. However, and I'm now going to contradict myself from the previous question, the way I would do that if that was you have to write this, is I'd have the forward-facing villain and behind-the-scenes villain. So my last chapter becomes the reveal. What, it wasn't Thanos, it was his daughter? That kind of thing. But you'd still want to have your front-facing villain carry all the weight, and then your reveal is oh my God, did you read the last chapter of the book? Kind of thing. Yes?
Kind of got a two-parter. So like for the Wicked Witch of the East or West, I forgot which one. If we just threw in a beat to establish some kind of a loving relationship between the sisters, would have enhanced that film.
Absolutely.
It
Absolutely.
doesn't have to be elaborate. It could be
No, and it doesn't even have to be loving, but if there is a relationship there where you define these two people are connected and matter to each other, that to me would have elevated her considerably. But I mean, it's a children's story. It doesn't have, you don't have to have all that.
The second part is villains like an institution, like Big Brother in 1984 or the Empire in Star Wars. Do we just use the representative, Darth Vader or the Emperor?
You have to tell a particular story and decide what's right for your story. Not every story has a clear-cut villain or a clear-cut hero sometimes. Orwell was telling a political fable. So he was not looking to have a villain. He was looking to tell an allegory about the dangers of political power. So he didn't have a villain, and I would argue he shouldn't have had a villain. It was not appropriate for his story.
When you're designing a villain, where and how do you start?
When I'm designing a villain, I usually start with their tragedy. Because the tragedy leads to the motivation, sometimes it leads to the power, leads to the immorality. The tragedy to me is the thing that's going to help define all that. Now, I say that's how I would usually do it. Sometimes you get the great idea, what if this guy wanted to do this? And you have to back into the other things. But tragedy, to me, sits at the hot little core and the center of who the villain is, and everything else sort of builds on top of that.
What about... Yeah, there we go. What are some ways that you could maybe do like a redemption arc for a villain? Does a villain actually really get a redemption arc, or are they more like a antagonist in that point?
I didn't talk about that here because I was more interested in defining a great villain, and I only had 45 minutes, down to 1 minute and 4 seconds now. So I think a redemption arc is totally possible. I actually had parts of the slide that I removed about solving the villain, and redemption is one of them. You can kill him, you can jail him, you can redeem him. There are many ways to defeat a villain. Darth Vader arguably went through a redemption arc, and I credited him as a great villain up here.
My question goes back to the great villain reveal at the end. So say your villain isn't obvious at the beginning, but their acts are obvious. Is that equally helpful throughout the plot, or do you really need that face?
It depends on what else you are doing. I was clearly focusing on a very particular thing, and for what I'm looking at, the villain needs to show up in the first half of the book somewhere so that they have a presence, so that they have that screen time. But everybody here could probably cite 10 amazing books that don't do that, and they come out really great anyway. 2 seconds left, so we're going to terminate this, and you guys can ask your questions up here to me personally. But that is the end of the talk. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience.